For today, this is what we're going to paint. I've created a black and white version. What does this show us? It shows us that, the light, so the light is somewhere probably over here, and you can sort of see how if we look at the sky, it's sort of lighter in tone here, getting darker as you move away from the light, and then also up above, it's darker up here, getting lighter as you get closer to the ground. Let's wet the back. Let's let that sit there for a bit. So we've got the big blue sky. We've got lots of sand. That'll do for now. So the sky is going to be lovely cobalt blue. Just going to clean the top of this. Normally I don't worry, but for skies I do like quite a clean blue. That'll do. Let's put that there, and then for the sand, we'll start with some raw umber. A little bit of burnt sienna. And that will do. Let's wet this again. This is one of those times when I like to paint on a flat board, and I'll also pre-wet the sky area, right? Remember, watercolor, there are no hard and fast rules. It's basically, the only rule is use what's the right thing at the right time. I need to hold this up. Now the reason I've got this flat is if I'm going to protect those white areas, then by having it flat, the paint won't flow anywhere near as much as when the board is at my usual 15 to 20 degrees. Establishing the horizon line. So we'll give that a moment for the water to soak in. Because I've wet the paper, the actual tone I'd end up with would be a lot weaker than this. So before I do anything else, now that I've decided to pre-wet the front of the paper, I'm going to add a little bit more paint. Good. And let's see how that goes. Go back to the paper. Just want to get rid of some of this excess water. This is fine. I've picked up some paint and I've taken out half of the paint from the brush. And when we paint these wispy clouds, what are we actually painting? We're going to be painting the shapes between the clouds. If you see a cloud like this, you don't paint the cloud, you paint the shape around it. I'm going in with my darkest tones first. A little bit weaker over here, so I'll dip the brush in water. And you have to leave enough space between the sky area that as some of the paint flows, it will still flow because it's just water, right? So some of the paint will still flow, but you don't want it to flow that much that you lose your cloud shape. I like the fact this comes in like that, comes all the way to there. Now I'm using a weaker mix down here. I'm not going to worry about this cloud in the distance. I don't think it's doing anything for the painting. Normally I'd like to paint the sand with the board at an angle, but this is not a big shape, so I can still paint it like this using a similar technique to what I've used in the sky. I've got my sand color here. It's going to be lighter in the distance, so I'll begin by dragging the brush through the edge of my palette and then dipping it about 1/4 inch into clean water. Throw in a bit up there. It's important that you don't just paint all the way down here and then start over here. You're painting across the paper so that your tone strengthens uniformly as I move into the foreground. I'm going to lighten this a bit more. This is fine. Now I'm going to pick up some of this thicker paint. It's too thick. So I'm painting without a lot of paint in my brush. I'll just dilute that a bit more. And what's happening here is some of the burnt sienna and raw umber mix is flowing into this blue and dulling the blue, which is what it should be doing. Just dilute that a little bit, just tip the tip of my brush in water. Okay, then let's soften this edge. This is a bit too strong, so I'll just lighten some of that. And the wet sand is darker in tone than the dry sand. I just added some Cobalt Blue into the sand mixture. There's a lot less of it in the distance. even along the creek bed. It'll be a bit darker just at the water's edge. I made the mistake of going in with too much water there into a damp area, so I have to be very careful I don't create a cauliflower. Lift a bit of this paint. I just want a bit more variation in tone as this paint moves into the distance. Great, that'll do. Okay, main thing is let's nail this sky. And as far as the sand's concerned, as long as it's lighter in tone there and stronger in tone here, and a bit cooler there and a bit warmer here, that'll be fine. Just going to grab some of this Cobalt Blue. Normally I wouldn't bother using the Cobalt Blue, but the blue from the sky is going to be reflecting into the water anyway. But primarily it's French Ultramarine for the water, and a little bit of burnt Sienna just to grey that off. And that's pretty good. Then as I come forward, I'll add some Cobalt Turquoise. So let's start with this. Now, one thing I've done here, I meant to put a spray into the sky, and while I left a gap in the horizon, I still ended up painting through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape some of that out. I don't want these sprays to be too big. And I'm making these sprays two different sizes. I'm painting over the pencil mark first, just to establish the horizon line. And quick little dry brush strokes. This is a very thin shape here. Your dry brush stroke is something you really have to practice because it really does add an extra dimension to your painting. See, I've added a bit more burnt sienna, water and cobalt turquoise for this transition. Might add a bit of the turquoise mix back here as well. And the waves, they're not quite horizontal, but they're only at a very gentle angle. Quick brush strokes vary the shape and the spacing between these waves. Bit more burnt sienna. As we get closer to the shore, the water is going to look more brownish because of the sand that's tossed up. And then the waves themselves will have little shadow areas. I'm going to get just a minute amount of permanent rose, some of this cobalt blue mix. Just drop that in as a dry brush stroke at the bottom of some of these waves. Then I'll pick up some of this weaker mixture here and put a little curve in some of these waves that are breaking. And I've left a lot of white around the rocks because that will be the foam on the rocks. If we look at some of these waves, if you look at this spot here, you can see how the vertical wave is darker in tone than the flat water around it, in parts, right? So for that, all I'll do is I'll find a darker sea color, like this is what I used for the ocean, and I'll drop some of that in. It's all got to be done while the paper is still really probably damp at this stage, but I'm not putting a lot of paint on my brush. I'm just touching the tip of the brush to the paper. Let's make some clean space in my palette. And I definitely don't need a lot of Cobalt Blue, so let's get rid of most of that. Keeping some because I'll use it when I'm doing the little creek here. So for the rocks, let's start with burnt sienna and some French ultramarine. Just a fraction more. And then we've got some greens. We've got a bright green and a darker green. So the bright green, this is where we'll just use Aureolin. A little bit of Cobalt Turquoise. into one part of it. I'm going to add French Ultramarine, a little bit of burnt Sienna, more Aureolin, more turquoise. Now I'm using a fan brush. See how those dry brush strokes they just look so much more interesting than a sharp edge. Let's put a bit of colour in for these buildings. And then I lift little highlights here and there. Again, making sure it's not too regular. That gives us a nice grouping. Good. Get a very weak blue mix. So the light's coming from over here. So these sprays will have a shadow side. Most of the shadow is going to be at the back. And we'll get a bit of this darker blue. Let's do this creek bed. And for that, we've got burnt sienna. And some cobalt blue. Let's just start with this weaker mix. Let's paint the reflection of this cliff face. In fact, this is a bit too strong. Okay, now let's do this creek. Bit of dry brush there. This has more blue in it. And if you put in too much blue, just add a bit more burnt sienna. I'm going to soften this edge. And you'll see on this curve here there's a shadow, but we'll have to wait for that to dry a bit before we put that in. This is a bit more brown. It's too brown. Still too brown. Okay. Here I'm just making sure it's not just a flat wash. All right, so now here we've got the reflections of these trees in the water. Let me just mix a little puddle burnt sienna with a little bit of cobalt turquoise. And I'm going to use that same mix to put a shadow along this edge. Paint a bit quicker now because I've dried the paper and it's still a bit warm from the hairdryer. I get a slightly darker mix of that. It's probably a bit too dark. Just to add a bit more variety in this reflection. So again, there'll be dark areas and lighter areas. Just some detail up here. You're going to just mix a bit of French ultramarine, a little bit of permanent rose, just to create a cool shadow colour. And I can use that just to adjust some of these tones and shapes. These are all just abstract shapes. I'm not trying to be too particular with it. This is a bit too open, right? So what we're going to do, actually some of these little highlights, we'll just turn them into rocks. Not all of them. Some of them can just be light patches in the sand. Got this figure here. Let's give her a reddish top. It will have a child next to it. Little shadow. They're a long way away, so they're just shaped. There's not a lot of detail for them. And here, just a couple of squiggles like that. I'm going to throw in a few footprints just in the foreground. Just realised we're going to throw some birds in the sky too. Vary the size and the shape of these birds. Still might need to darken the odd edge. That will do it.